Hello, true crimers. How much time do you have today? Good, a lot? Okay. This is by far my most ambitious compilation video from my TikTok. This one's going to be over 2 hours, I think. It's got 40 videos. I just wanted to finish up my playlist of unsolved / cold cases, so I had 40 more to go, so I just said, screw it, there you go. So I'm not going to waste too much time here in the intro. So these are going to be 40 cases that are unsolved. By the way, if you notice any cases that I've covered that has updates, I may not know the update yet because I cover so many freaking stories. So if you could comment it below that there's an update, but for me to see it, can you email me like, hey, there's an update or progress in this case, or someone got caught or whatever. That way I can make an update video on a particular case. It's just really hard for me to go back to every single one and check on all of them. Real quick before I go, please make sure you subscribe to me on YouTube here. I do tell original, single story cases multiple times a week, and I do these compilation videos. Please follow me on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. It's all linked below. I sell merch. It's linked below. I have a Discord. It's below. Blah, 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 blah. All right. Anyway, here are 40 unsolved cases. Viewer discretion is advised. A missing woman, a murdered father, a suspicious cop. This is a wild one, y'all. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of Crystal Rogers. Viewer discretion is advised. Crystal was a 34-year-old mother of 5 kids from Bardstown, Kentucky. And in 2015, she is living with her boyfriend, Brooks Hocutt, who is also the father of one of her kids. On the late evening of July 3rd, 2015, according to Brooks Hocutt, Crystal was last seen playing a game on her phone, and then he went to bed. When he woke up in the morning, their child was in bed with him, but Crystal was nowhere to be seen. He went out to the front of the house and saw that her car was gone. Brooks claimed that he tried calling Crystal's cell phone, but he couldn't get a hold of her. But who really knows if that's true or not, Brooks? Her parents, Sherry and Tommy Ballard, also tried getting a hold of her, but they also had no luck. Then, a major break. Crystal's 2007 maroon Chevy vehicle was found on the side of the highway. The keys were in the ignition, her purse, her wallet, her phone, all of it still inside the car, and there was a flat tire. But Crystal? Nowhere to be seen. And that is when her mother, Sherry, reported her missing officially. Now, her mom and her dad, they both had pretty strong opinions on who may have done something to Crystal. The suspicion, of course, fell right onto Brooks Hocutt. He was the last person to see her alive, and what's more suspicious, he hasn't helped search for her at all. He has been completely uncooperative. He never even asked for status updates on where police were. The last place that Crystal was ever seen alive was on the Hocutt family farm, and no witnesses saw her ever leave the property. Brooks was brought in and interrogated briefly. I say briefly because Brooks has a special brother. A police officer named Nick Hocutt is his brother. He called mid-interrogation to speak to Brooks and said, stop talking to them right now. So he did, and he stopped. So now Nick is under suspicion. As a matter of fact, he would end up getting fired from his job. He took a polygraph with the FBI, and the FBI said they were very concerned about his results. While searching the Hocutt family farm, they said they found items of interest, but have not released what those are. They're also concerned about a white Buick that was last seen on the Hocutt property the night that Crystal disappeared, which the Hocutt grandmother owns a white Buick. She was subpoenaed to testify in front of a grand jury. She didn't show up. On November 19th, 2016, Crystal's father, Tommy Ballard, was hunting on his property when he was suddenly shot in the chest and killed. Who did it? Unknown, but it is considered a murder, and Crystal has vanished off the face of the earth. Officer Jason Ellis, Kathy and Samantha Netherland, Crystal Rogers, and Tommy Ballard. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of the Bardstown murders. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, earlier today, I put out a video about the disappearance of Crystal Rogers and the suspicion surrounding her boyfriend at the time, Brooks Hocutt. Now, this happened in 2015, but the murders started 2 years earlier. This was Officer Jason Ellis, a cop who did not ruffle any feathers. He was well respected, and he was just a beloved member of the community. On May 25th, 2013, he had gotten off his shift sometime around 1:30 in the morning. When he exited onto the Bluegrass Parkway, the ramp was blocked with trees down the road. So he pulled up to the trees that were in the road and he tried to move them. Well, it turns out this whole thing was a trap. Hiding somewhere on a nearby hilltop was an unknown shooter with a 12-gauge shotgun. They fired several times at Jason Ellis, striking him and killing him. Bardstown police had leads they followed up on, but nothing has ever led to anything close to an arrest. Suspects seem to be non-existent. There was a member of a gang called the Bardstown Money Gang who claimed that they were responsible for the murder of the officer. The gang member who came forward is actually related to the mayor of Bardstown, but police were never able to actually connect the two. So everything just went cold. And to this day, his murder is still unsolved. Less than a year later, tragedy would strike again. Keep in mind, this is a small town in Kentucky. This type of stuff doesn't happen. In April of 2014, mother Kathy Netherland and her 16-year-old daughter Samantha, they were shot dead in their home. Kathy was a special education teacher. She didn't show up to work one morning, so Samantha's father went to check on them, and that's when he found their bodies. Kathy was shot dead, Samantha had been bludgeoned to death, and both women had their throats cut. Police were able to uncover that a black Chevy Impala was seen in the area of the house, and this is the vehicle driving away from the house. The owner of the car has never been identified. The murder of the mother and daughter, like Jason Ellis, still unsolved. 2015, Crystal Rogers goes missing. Watch the commented video for more details on that. A year after her disappearance, her father, Tommy Ballard, who was persistent in finding out what happened to his daughter, he was shot dead from someone from afar. What is the connection between all of them? Is there a connection? Crystal's mother speculates, and I kind of agree, that the Hocutt family had something to do with Ellis's murder. She somehow overheard it, so she had to be killed. He had to because of his persistence. But what's their connection? Hello, true crimers! This is the case of the Bible Belt Strangler, also known as the Redhead Murders. On September 16th, 1984, the body of Lisa Nichols, she was found off of the I-40 in West Memphis, Arkansas. It would actually take almost a year for them to identify her. Authorities suspect that she might have been picked up by a trucker at a rest stop, and he was likely her killer. On January 1st, 1985, the body of 21-year-old Tina Farmer. Well, she was found in Jellicoe, Tennessee. Her body was just thrown down an embankment, and she was pretty badly decomposed when she was found. She was killed by being strangled. She had curly locks of red hair, just like our first victim had red hair. Her body was found wrapped in a blanket, and that blanket had, well, DNA on it. Male DNA, and I'll let you figure that one out. And sadly, they would also find out that she was about 10 to 12 weeks pregnant. She would not be identified until September of 2018, and she was last seen with a trucker. In 2019, they had a breakthrough with the DNA that was left on the comforter she was wrapped in. The DNA was a match to Jerry Leon Johns, a man who was convicted of kidnapping. Johns died in prison in 2015, but a grand jury stated that if he were still alive, he would have been indicted for the murder of Tina Farmer. On April 3rd, 1985, skeletal remains of this victim, a Jane Doe only known as the Campbell County victim, she was found near Jellicoe, Tennessee. They figured out that her body had been there at least a year, but possibly up to 4 years. But she had a knot tied around her neck in fabric, so they determined that she was likely strangled to death. Unfortunately, they don't really know what her hair color or eye color was. March 31st, 1985, they found the skeletal remains of another victim, a Jane Doe only known as the Cheatham County, Tennessee victim. They did not have any composite drawings of her, but this is a part of her clothing, this hat. She was dumped in the same vicinity as the other victims. On April 1st, 1985, the body of what's now been identified as the body of Epsie Pilgrim was found inside of a refrigerator in Kentucky. She also died by strangulation or suffocation. She wasn't identified either until 2018. And this is why it's known as the Bible Belt Strangler, because they all kind of aligned in that area of the country. And they would be dumped in just open kind of field areas or embankments and just thrown out like garbage, you know. It is likely that Jerry Leon Johns is the man who killed all of these women, and possibly more. There are other victims. If it was him, he's in hell now. This is one of the weirdest cases I've ever told. There's a fortune teller involved, for God's sakes. This country. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Joey Fischer. Viewer discretion is advised. Joey was an 18-year-old living in Rancho Viejo, Texas. He was a well-respected young man. He was considered funny and energetic. He was highly intelligent, and he had dreams and aspirations of becoming an engineer. He already had plans to go to college for it. That didn't get to happen. During his junior year in high school, he started dating Cristina Cisneros, who had a mother named Dora. She looks sweet, right? Well, first of all, she approved of the relationship between her daughter and Joey. Like, really fucking approved of it. Dora Cisneros was described as someone who was extremely protective of her family. So when Joey eventually broke up with her daughter, Dora would start exploring some options. First, she began to pester the boy. She called him day and night saying, "Why did you break up with my daughter? Get back together with her right now. Please get back together with my daughter." Like, no would literally do this to him. And Joey was always polite. He said "Ma'am, your daughter is a lovely girl. I'm just not wanting to date anyone right now." Dora then started harassing Joey's father, saying, "Why did your son break up with my daughter? He's old enough to make his own decisions. Leave it be." So she said, "Will you please meet with me and we'll discuss this in person?" So Joey's father actually agreed to do this. Gosh, she looks like a nice lady though. But anyway, the two parents met. He said the meeting was friendly, kind of awkward, and Joey's father went back to Joey and said, "Is there any way we can reconcile something where you guys can be friends?" It appears Joey did not agree, because Dora started calling Joey again, saying, "I will literally pay you money, $500, if you get back together with my daughter." And Joey said, "No, lady, please leave me alone." In Joey's senior year in high school, he started dating another girl. But also, Cristina started dating other boys. All good now, right? No. In the early morning hours of March 3rd, 1993, at his home, Joey would go outside and begin to water off the windshield of his vehicle, when all of a sudden, 2 gunshots rang out, and when his family went out to check to see what happened, Joey had been shot dead. Joey had a bullet through his heart and a bullet through his brain. It would be revealed that he was shot with a .38 caliber super pistol. Police believed that this was clearly the work of a drive-by shooting, but no one saw anything actually happen. But after some investigating, police discovered there was a shoe print right outside where Joey was shot that did not match his shoe or anyone else's shoe in the house. There was also a yellow business card there, and that business card was for a bail office in Texas. After reaching out to the bail office the card came from, they determined that it likely came from Rudy Cuellar, a recent bail applicant. He lived in Dallas, but he was originally from Mexico. And this is just where it just gets weird. They would trace Rudy Cuellar to a man by the name of Daniel El Guaro Garza. He was a man who lived in the Brownsville area, who had also gone back and forth to his, home country of Mexico. So, he would be linked, not, to a fortune teller whose picture I can't find, so you get this, to a fortune teller named, and I have to read this, Maria Mercedes Martinez de Sanchez. She apparently asked Mr. Garza to either complete the murder of Joey Fischer or hire someone who would murder Joey Fischer. But on whose behalf? Dora da Cisneros. Cuckoo Cachoo Wackadoo here also frequented that same fortune teller. She asked her if she could put a curse on Joey first. Like a curse to kill him. Martinez was like, no. She then said, okay, well, can you put a magic spell to make him get back together with my daughter, please? Again, she was like, no. Okay, and this one is just so confusing. So that is when she asked the fortune teller to see if she knew anyone who would do a hired hit. Apparently the fortune teller was like, oh, okay. That is when the fortune teller asked Mr. Garza. Mr. Garza then got in contact with some of his acquaintances from Mexico. And these were men who were part of the Quelar organization. We're going back to the guy who was the bail bonds thing. So Garza contacted a man by the name Olivares Cepeda and Heriberto Puentes. This is so convoluted. So they carried out the hit successfully. They got to Joey's house that morning, fired 2 rounds into him, and fled. So police uncovered this, and Garza, Cisneros, and Lady Fortune Teller were all arrested and charged with murder. Miss Martinez got 20 years for conspiracy to commit murder. Garza got life in prison, and after going through 2 trials, Dora Cisneros was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The actual shooters are still at large.
The girl I killed was working in a ladies' sportswear store. I often came by and talked to her when she was working alone.
The voice you just heard was that of a likely murderer, one who has never been caught. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of Tracey Kirkpatrick. Viewer discretion is advised. Tracey was a 17-year-old who lived in Frederick, Maryland. At the time of her case, she was working 2 different part-time jobs and was going to college to one day hopefully be an attorney. Sadly, that dream would never come true. On the evening of March 15th, 1989, she was scheduled to close the Eileen Ladies Sportswear store. Sometime around 8 or 8:30 or so, her mom walks into the store just to say hi. The manager of the store comes in shortly after that and then leaves. At 8:45 p.m., Tracey was then alone. At approximately 10:50 p.m., the security guard of the complex there noticed the lights inside the store were still on. This was highly unusual since they were supposed to be closed. Even more alarming, the front door was unlocked. The security guard would slowly walk towards the back of the store, and when he entered the storeroom, he would find the bloodied body of Tracey Kirkpatrick. She had multiple stab wounds across her chest and also some in her back. There were small drops of blood that would lead from the storeroom to this back hallway that connects multiple stores. And then that door at the end was the exit. She was not sexually assaulted. All of the money in the till was still there. Her purse was missing, but police still weren't sure if the motive truly was robbery or if they took her purse to make it look like one. There was no sign of forced entry, there was no sign of any struggle, so it's very likely that she was familiar with the person who did this to her. 3 months later, in June of 1989, a man calling himself Don would call a national tip line and confess. This is that call. It is a little hard to understand, but still, this call may be disturbing to some.
Hello, my name is Don, and I'm calling from Frederick, Maryland. I know this is going to sound surprising, but 3 months ago, I stabbed a girl to death. And you might think that in making this tape, I'm setting myself up to be caught, but there are a lot of guys named Don in Frederick. The girl I killed was working in a ladies' sportswear store. I often came by and talked to her when she was working alone. And one night when she was in the storeroom and we were talking, our conversation turned into an argument. And so I took out a knife that I have with me at all times and I killed her. And a few days later I realized that I had created a lot of sadness. And I thought about turning myself into the police. whatever they do to me, that won't bring Tracey back. So, I've decided that I better keep free because we have the death penalty in Maryland. Thanks for listening. I'm sorry about what I did, but nothing can change it. Bye.
So yeah, pretty disturbing. Feel free to look it up on YouTube if you want to hear it like more clearly. So police were able to trace where that phone call came from. And it came from Walkersville, Maryland at a Safeway grocery store. And that's just right outside of Frederick, where this murder takes place. So then police put out something like an invitation in the local newspapers to see if Don would call back. He never did. A few months later, in October of 1989, a psychic would come forward with some information. She said she was getting phone calls from a guy claiming his name was Sean, and he was not confessing to the murder, but he was really obsessed with her murder. So police would go to that psychic and play the audio for her, and because she had heard his voice, obviously, and she said, yeah, that sounds just like Sean. Now, this Sean also sent newspaper clippings of the murder to the psychic, and so police were able to take the envelope, and they discovered they were from Walkersville, Maryland, exactly where the phone call came from. They went to the address, and there was no one who lived there named Sean or Don. So then, police would go to using the radio. They would play the call of Don's voice, and 3 people came forward to say, yeah, I recognize that voice. All 3 of them said the same person. And it was the person who lived at the house where the letters were coming from to the psychic, the guy who claimed to be Sean. But again, he was not named Sean, he was not named Don. Because there was no real physical evidence left behind, maybe like a fingerprint, police, they could not rule this person who lived at that house in or out. When the man who lived at the house was finally questioned by police, he stayed silent. Now, is creepy confession phone caller Don the same person as the guy who called the psychic and sent her letters? Police say it's very possible that they are the same person. Here's one last twist to the puzzle. The security guard who actually went into the building and found her body, guess what his name is? Don. Don's father? Well, he used to be the chief of police. So was he properly investigated? Who knows. But he was ruled out, as was an ex-boyfriend of hers. And unfortunately, the murder of Tracey Kirkpatrick is very much unsolved. I have a feeling they're right on the cusp, like, it's one of these people. Hopefully with today's technology, if they do have DNA, maybe they can link it to someone. But sadly for now, her family has zero closure. Please contact Frederick, Maryland Police if you have any information. Here in the deserts of Death Valley, a young man would be found dead, missing his organs. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of Ryan Singleton. Viewer discretion is advised. Ryan, who at the time lived in Atlanta, Georgia, was an aspiring actor and model. His modeling career had basically already started, but he wanted to go farther than that. He left his home in Atlanta when he was about 21 years old. He went to New York and he managed to get some gigs, walking the runways. He would then end up marrying a stylist named Keith Brewster. Yes, Ryan Singleton was a gay man as well. But their marriage only lasted roughly a few months, and then after it broke off, he moved back to Atlanta with his mom. But Ryan, pictured here with his mom, he still really, really wanted to pursue that career in acting. And his mom believed he could be a star because he had that kind of star quality. He had an infectious smile, an infectious personality, and he certainly would have gone places. In July of 2013, Ryan would fly out to Los Angeles, and then he would rent a car, and then he would make like a little trip, so he would be driving to Las Vegas. Unfortunately, during his drive, his rental car somewhere near Baker, California, kind of in the area of Death Valley, well, his car would break down. A CHP officer found him and actually brought him back to a nearby gas station. Ryan would then call a friend to come pick him up. His friend, who was leaving from Los Angeles, would drive out to Baker to get him. But when he got there, the friend, Ryan was gone. The friend drove all over. He searched for him, but he couldn't locate him. So he would end up going back to Los Angeles and then filing a missing persons report on his friend, and then he would also alert Ryan's mother. 74 days later, two men were walking along the highway, and they noticed kind of off in the distance what looked like a person lying on the ground. Death Valley is a very unforgiving place. It's not somewhere you would want to be stranded. As they approached this individual, it wasn't really a person anymore. It was a nearly fully decomposed human body. Primarily, it was skeleton, and they were still wearing all of their clothing. Dental records would come back and show that it was the body of Ryan Singleton. The strangest part is he was missing bones, and he was also missing several of his internal organs. The autopsy could not determine his cause of death. The suspicion is it was some sort of homicide, but how and why it happened, no one knows. And where are his organs? The coroner says it's very likely that animals took them because there was no clean cuts, but could they have been harvested? Possibly, but to this day no one knows what happened to them. It's very, very bizarre. If you've watched the recent batch of Unsolved Mysteries episodes, this case may sound kind of familiar to you. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of Justin Hocutt. Viewer discretion is advised. Justin was born on August 16, 1985, and he lived in Seligman, Missouri. On October 8, 1999, in the very, very early, dark morning hours that day, Justin was last seen running from this house, his girlfriend's house, and his girlfriend's father was chasing him away. And after that, Justin appeared to go missing. Just a little under a day later, Justin was found. His body was on the train tracks. The train tracks were very close to his home. The train tracks saw, parts of his clothing kind of just scattered everywhere. The other thing to note is that there was very minimal blood spatter anywhere. So if Justin was alive when the train hit him, they say you would probably see a lot more blood. It appeared to them that Justin was likely placed on the tracks. And so this is where it deviates from that Unsolved Mysteries case from the new episodes. Justin's case was almost immediately labeled a homicide. Authorities would determine, based on how his body was found and also based on witness statements, that Justin was either killed before being placed on the tracks or he was knocked unconscious and then placed on the tracks. According to the articles I've read, which there are very few about this case, they interviewed over 30 suspects and have never actually been able to charge anyone. Now, my first thought goes to the girlfriend's father, who was seen chasing him out of the house. So, did he do something? The family of Justin seems to think they know who did it. They are very confident. In fact, they said they've been taunted by Justin's killer, but police don't have any physical evidence to connect these people to his murder. Something else kind of odd I read, and I don't know if there was ever a solution to this, but his father, Tim Hocutt, a month or two later, he went missing. But I can't find anything if he ever got back or was ever found. So I have no idea if that has anything to do with this. But sadly, they have nothing to go on, other than they know he was murdered and he was placed on the tracks to cover their tracks. Poor choice of words. If you have any information on the murder of Justin Hocutt, please contact 866-362-6422. Let's get him some justice. This is the unsolved murder of Cody Pitts. Cody was a 26-year-old living in Hubbard, Ohio, and he was also known as the Gentle Giant. He was 6'3", 240 pounds, but everyone described him as the nicest, kindest person you'd ever meet. A guy who would take a shirt off his back and give it to you if you needed it. But on March 7th, 2015, at approximately 2:35 a.m., Cody left the downtown cafe and patio bar on Main Street. He was there just chilling with his buds, throwing back a few, and having a grand old time. There was nothing out of the ordinary. When he left, he crossed North Street and began walking down Orchard Street. They believed Chad was walking to his friend's house, but less than 1 hour later, Cody would be found dead in a pile of snow with a gunshot wound to his head and neck. And this was actually the first known homicide in that community since the early 90s. It was a community that seemed that everyone knew each other. So they assumed, okay, someone who killed him must have known him and they'll be caught very soon. Nope. In fact, there is almost no evidence. There's no tips. His murderer has just vanished, poof, into thin air. To make matters worse on the family, 1 month after Cody was shot dead, his mother, Veda, she was diagnosed with cancer, and she would lose her battle with cancer just 8 months later. During the same exact week, Cody's birthday would have been. She was 56 years old. The small community honors Cody by turning on green lights on their porches, and they celebrate his life every year around his birthday. This being a small town with really no homicide cases, this case is number 1 still on their list, and they are desperate for information. So, if you have any information that could pertain to finding the killer of Cody Pitts, please call Crime Stoppers of Youngstown at 330-746-2583. Or you can call Hubbard City Detective Mike Bannock, B-A-N-I-C, at 330-534-6286. And currently a $25,000 reward is being offered to any tips that lead to an arrest. It's been 6 years, so hopefully sometime very soon his family will finally get the closure they need. Hello, true crimers. Apparently today is a day I'm giving you cases with no closure, so let's keep it going. This is the case of the Oakland County child killer from Oakland County, Michigan. Between February 1976 and March 1977, 4 children were kidnapped, held against their will, and murdered. And then they were all dumped like garbage. 11-year-old Timothy King, 10-year-old Christine Mihalik, 12-year-old Mark Stebbins, and 12-year-old Jill Robinson. And you can see the close proximity that they were all dumped. All 4 children were strangled and shot. And the 2 boys in this case were both sexually assaulted, but the girls were not. This led to one of the biggest murder investigations in the history of the United States up to that point. Because when you have 4 innocent children picked up off the street and brutally murdered, you need to do everything you possibly can to catch the guy who did this. But unfortunately, they never did. They managed to get these composite drawings from witness statements. Is it just me, or do composite drawings, especially from back then, look terrifying? Like, if I saw a person who looked like this last guy, I'd piss my pants. They all kind of look like Elvis in a weird way. At one point, witnesses even said John Wayne Gacy was seen kidnapping these children. And he was allegedly in the area, but the DNA they had did not match him at all. One of their primary suspects was a man named Chris Bush. He was the son of a GM executive, Harold Lee Bush. He was actually arrested shortly before Tim King's abduction, and he was arrested for child pornography. Chris Bush allegedly ended his own life in November of 1978. He had a gunshot right between his eyes, but there was no gunshot residue on him, and there was no blood splatter. And there were several shell casings found around the room, and he was wrapped in his own bed sheets pretty tight. 20 months prior to his death, there were no abductions. Another suspect was Archibald Edward Sloan. Yeah, that basically sounds like a murderer's name. He was actually a known child molester. He became a suspect when hairs that were found in his vehicle, a 1966 Pontiac Bonneville, matched hairs that were found on the 2 boy victims. But the hair itself, the samples, were not actually from him. Timothy King, who's this one, his kidnapping was allegedly witnessed, and they said that was 2 different men who kidnapped him. One appeared to be in his early 20s, and one a lot older, and this is the one who allegedly looked like John Wayne Gacy. Apparently at the time, it matched sort of what he looked like. He also would take 2 polygraph tests, and he failed both of them, with regards to this case specifically. But unfortunately, there's no concrete evidence to tie anyone to this case. And now several decades later, it's still unsolved. This is the unsolved case of Morgan Violi. At approximately 12:30 p.m. on July 24th, 1996, 7-year-old Morgan here was playing with her friend at the apartment complex's playground. and this was the Colony Apartments in Bowling Green, Kentucky. One of Morgan's sisters, Heather, saw that Morgan wasn't wearing any shoes, so she told her to go put on shoes. And this is when Morgan started to walk back towards the apartment with her friend. At around 12:36 p.m., when out of nowhere a maroon Chevrolet van pulled up next to the girls. A man reached out and first grabbed Morgan's friend, but then decided to take Morgan instead. So he took her and he threw her into the van. Morgan's sister Heather heard her screaming, so she bolted towards where this was all happening. This is when Heather saw a man sitting in the van who turned to her and smiled. This is a composite drawing of the man that was sitting in the van. Authorities would conclude that this van, and this is not the exact van, was believed to have been stolen out of Dayton, Ohio, just a few days prior. First of all, side note, is Ohio the Florida of true crime, or what? Jesus. Now, the following day, a white 1979 Chevy van that had a slatted trailer-like window on the side, which is what this is the composite drawing of, what people saw. This van was seen parked next to a barn, this exact barn right here, on North Swift Road at Webster Road in Robertson County. Witnesses said the white van, again, one that looks like this one, was parked there roughly 4 hours or so. The search for Morgan lasted months, and by the end of the search, they wouldn't have good news. On October 20th, 1996, approximately 100 feet away from this barn where the white van was seen, the decomposed remains of Morgan Violi were found. Because of how badly her body was decomposed, it did take some time to officially confirm it was her. The hair samples they pulled from the remains were similar to the hair of Morgan Violi. She did appear to be wearing the same clothes that she was wearing that day, but eventually they would compare dental records and they were a perfect match. Some people believe that Morgan's father, Glenn, was a suspect, even though the FBI and the authorities never officially. He was going through a divorce with their mother, but he actually arrived at the apartment complex at 12:50 p.m., so just shortly after the abduction happened. According to him, the FBI said that he hired someone to take and kill Morgan, but no one was ever able to prove that. He did fail a few polygraph tests in regards to this case, but take those with a grain of salt. Glenn is actually an artist as well. He drew this composite drawing of the man the witnesses described. And then this is the one the police sketch artist did. If you have any information, please call this number. This is the still unsolved murder of 16-year-old Stephanie Hart and 15-year-old Nicholas Kunselman. This case happened a little over 20 years ago, on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2000. And this case involves two students from Columbine High School, where a mass shooting had taken place a little less than a year prior to this. Nick was working at a Subway where he was finishing his shift on that fateful evening. Stephanie, Nick's girlfriend, was there at the shop with him waiting for him to close up. On that same evening, after the store was supposed to be closed and the lights turned off, another employee of that Subway just happened to drive by. And from the road, they noticed all the lights were still on, so they turned into the parking lot to see what was going on. When this employee walked into the Subway, they noticed the dead bodies of both Nick and Stephanie. They had both been shot to death. To make it more terrifying, these two were actually present at Columbine High School a year prior during that shooting. And they were fortunate to survive, only to then have this happen. Unfortunately, that's essentially the end of this story. This has become a freezing cold case. They had virtually no evidence to go with. There was some DNA they collected, but it's not matched to anyone, and no one really knows if it's even the killer, whose DNA it is. This is a Subway where many people are coming in and leaving skin cells and all that stuff. The police released a description saying it was a white male between the ages of 16 and 20, about 5'7" and between 150 to 170 pounds, and they have blondish hair. But that description is only coming from tips they've gotten from various sources across the country. There were even false confessions to the murder. There was even suspicions that a drug ring was operating out of this Subway shop. But that, along with the confessions and most of the tips, all of it was false. Just a few months ago, the authorities have upped the reward money to $100,000. And it has to be credible tips. So if you live in the Denver, Colorado area and you know something about this case, please contact Metro Denver Crime Stoppers at 720-913-7867. You can also go online and submit a tip. You can also do this anonymously if you choose. It's been far too long, so let's try to find them some justice. Thank you. Hello, true crimers. This is the unsolved murder of Dana Bradley. And guess what? We're going up north to talk about this one, you know? On December 14th, 1981, in St. John's, Newfoundland, up in Canada, 14-year-old Dana Bradley was hitchhiking. She was walking down a road called Topsail Road. She was just chilling over at a friend's house that afternoon, and when she was done, she decided to, I guess, leg it back home. The family was having a birthday party for another family member, so that's why she was trying to get home. But when Dana never made it home, her family, almost immediately reported her missing, which they did to the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary. So sorry if I said that wrong. Now, an eyewitness would come forward a little bit down the road, within a couple days or so, that said that they saw Dana Bradley get into a vehicle with an unknown male. And the vehicle they described kind of looks like this one here. God, cars in the 80s look really stupid. The eyewitness was also able to give a description of the male they saw in the car. And he basically looked like this. Honestly, to me, he looks like every other dude out there. But sadly, 4 days later, Dana Bradley's body would be discovered. She was a little south of St. John's on a road called Maddox Cove. Several years would pass by. The police would interrogate hundreds of people. They got tips somewhere upwards of thousands and thousands per year. They searched and ruled out several hundred cars that looked like the one that they saw, Dana getting into that afternoon, but nothing. Then in 1986, a man by the name of David Grant Somerton was actually charged with her murder because he confessed to killing her. But then, sometime later, he recanted his statement and said, "I was coerced by the police to confess to this murder." Oh good, do you guys have scumbag cops up in Canada as well? And with no physical evidence connecting him to the crime, they had no choices but to drop all charges against him. At a later date, he was actually charged and imprisoned for falsifying a confession. And he actually served 2 years in prison for it. That's crazy to me, especially if they coerced him. Fast forward all the way to 2016. While searching through evidence and examining evidence, police would actually find a new DNA source on one of the pieces of evidence left on the crime scene. It was to an unknown male DNA, and they tested it against him just to be sure he was not it. But the DNA also hasn't matched anyone else. Also in 2016, a man who claimed to be in the car when this happened, as a child, said the car was buried somewhere. So the police dug it up. But there was no evidence to be found because the car was completely destroyed, caked in filth and mud and mildew. But I guess this witness also has no idea who the man is either, but allegedly confirmed he does look like this. And her killer still walks free. Alright, true crimers, we got ourselves another Jane Doe. She is known as the Walker County Jane Doe from Texas. On November 1st, 1980, the unclothed body of a girl between the ages of 14 and 20 was found by a truck driver. She was lying face down, and the autopsy would reveal that she was only killed about 6 hours prior. And she was also sexually assaulted. You can see she was wearing this necklace there. Her ears were pierced, although she had no earrings on. Next to her body was a pair of high-heeled red leathered sandals, but most of her clothing was missing. Her stomach contents would show that she was eating regularly, and her body was in relatively healthy shape. She was, however, beaten pretty severely. But even with all of this, no one has identified her. There is speculation she could be teenager Mary Kay Holst, who went missing in 1977, but it's just speculation. It's sad. Just hours after arriving in his new home state, a man would be brutally murdered. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of Dorian Bluford. Viewer discretion is advised. Dorian grew up in Monroe, Louisiana. As an adult, he had jobs like manager at a Walmart, manager at Burger King. He was described as someone who was just a really good leader. He was quiet and reserved, but sweet and funny. And given time to come out of his shell, like in a group, he would entertain them for hours. He was basically the quiet life of the party. Now, Dorian was also gay, and a lot of his family didn't know that, but some of his family did. And he had a friend who he described as his best friend. However, we don't know his name because his name has not been released publicly. Now, this unnamed friend of his, who his family actually knew of, well, he lived in Knoxville, Tennessee, and he managed to convince Dorian to move out there with him. This friend, who we'll just call Bill, I don't know, he was able to get Dorian a job. He got him a vehicle to use until he was able to get his own. And of course, he was going to put a roof over his head. Dorian's family wasn't too keen on the idea of him doing this, though, because his family only kind of vaguely knew, Bill, but Dorian was like, nope, I'm doing it. So he did. Now, at this point in the story, Dorian was actually living in Houston, Texas. So on May 30th, 2017, he flew out from Houston to Knoxville, Tennessee. Bill picked him up from the front of the airport in a white BMW, which police have been able to find that footage to confirm. At 4:20 p.m., Dorian made a Facebook post saying he landed and he was safe. A little after 7 o'clock, he made another Facebook post stating he was eating at a restaurant with his friend, which witnesses would claim to see both men. 2.5 hours after his last Facebook post, 911 was called. A couple who was moving out of an apartment near this Greenway Belt place said they heard the screams of a man saying, "He's stabbing me, he's stabbing me." When police finally arrived, the dead body of Dorian Bluford was found. He had been stabbed 37 times. There was no murder weapon nearby, no footprints or shoe prints. They collected no fingerprints from anything. There were no, hair samples. And the two witnesses didn't see anything or anyone, except they think they saw a white BMW pulling away. Now, police did find the friend, Bill, questioned him, but he claims to know nothing. Dorian's belongings were no longer in the friend's trunk, but the car, no murder weapon, no blood. If the friend lured him there and did it, there's no evidence to support it. But Bill seems very suspicious. This is still unsolved. An aspiring rapper would be gunned down during a live stream, and to this day, his killer is still out there. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of Zera Dejan Rivera. Viewer discretion is advised. Zera was a 21-year-old rapper from Hawthorne, California, and he actually went by the name Indian Red Boy. He was described by his family members as a fun-loving kid, basically, who loves to joke around. One of his favorite things to do was just to make others laugh and make others smile. He also had aspirations to be a rap artist. One day he goes into a record studio and they let him perform and they record a small album for him. So it looked like he was on his way to doing exactly what he wanted to do. But then unfortunately his mother passed away and then he ended up having to take care of his siblings. He was forced to grow up and mature more quickly in order to help take care of the kids. Eventually, he would take comfort in just being in the streets. Eventually, there were affiliations with gangs on the streets, but still, he seemed to be his carefree, just outgoing, loving person. On July 8th, 2021, in Hawthorne, California, he was doing an Instagram live stream. And he was doing so with a friend of his and a social media influencer by the name of Capone. Indian Red Boy, Capone, they're laughing, they're having a good time, and all of a sudden, you hear a barrage of gunfire. I stumbled into watching the video, and it made me sick to my stomach. So just be warned, because again, I know you are all curious, and some of you will look for this video. Indian Red Boy slouches over in his seat because he's in a vehicle, and his friend Capone is like, "What the hell?" And then you see Indian Red Boy kind of slouch back upwards, saying he's trying to mouth the words, "Get help," and, help me. But he's clearly struggling. And then another series of gunshots, and his phone falls out of his hand, and that's where it cuts off. Police would arrive on the scene, and he was pronounced dead there. And of course, the video went viral, but it does appear that this was a deliberate act. Whoever it was just walked straight up to his car and fired. So police are convinced that this was a targeted attack and this was not random. There were rumors that a mural being tagged led to the murder, but those have never been substantiated. There are rumors that this was because of a girl, but the reality is the police have nothing. Zero. Zilch. They have no clue who did this. If you know anything, you can call this number. This is the still unsolved murder of John Zera. On February 20th, 1976, 14-year-old John Zera just vanished from his school, Franklin High School. And this was in the Hales Corner, Wisconsin area. Sadly, 8 days after his disappearance, his body would be found in Whitnall Park. About 30 feet away from his body, his clothing and one of his shoes would be found. Throughout the investigation, police in the area would be criticized for their poor handling of this case, including really bad evidence collecting. They were accused of having, tunnel vision and suspects that should have been looked into more but never truly were. So the 14-year-old boy, he had been sexually assaulted, and the way he died was by being bludgeoned to death with a rock. And then written on his wrist was the word hell in bold, like a permanent marker. I don't have an image of him, but there was a substitute teacher at John's school that would be accused and became the main suspect for quite some time, but eventually he was cleared. Now this is a man by the name of Dan Acker. This is him throughout the decades. Dan Acker was a known pedophile. Dan Acker was poking his little nose in around the crime scene after the body was discovered. And if you know anything about true crime, you know that sometimes the psychology of killers, they love to go back to the scene of the crime. And sometimes insert themselves in the investigation, which he did. Dan would befriend the parents of John. He would go have dinner with them. Now, Dan had a little bit of a journal. And in these journals of his, he seemed to have a lot of details about this crime. One of the journal entries had him write, "Oddly enough, the boy's belt has not been found." On an entry he made in 1976, he wrote, and I quote, "Between 1:30 p.m. and 2 p.m., the boy is made to or completely is undressed. Even his socks are removed. Such is the horror John had to go through. The boy was sexually assaulted, but somehow after the assault, he managed to escape. But he was caught 30 feet away from the sexual assault area." He then would later write, "As I kneel, I see the fluid and the blood from the head trauma. To the left is the empty hole where the rock came from, telling me it was panic and the boy was killed because he tried to escape." Now, how would he know so much information? The police were told time and time again that this man is likely the person who did it. But he passed a polygraph test, so they're like, you know what? Probably not him. He was questioned several times over the years and always denied the murder. Dan even had models of buildings in his basement. In 2009, Dan was arrested and charged with the sexual assault of minors, several minors, but he has still yet to be charged with his murder. Insane. 10 unsolved murders across 6 years in Tokyo. Or are they unsolved? Hello, true crimers, and this wonderful fella here. This is the case known as the Tokyo Metropolitan Murders. Viewer discretion is advised. So, unfortunately, I do not have any pictures of the victims, of the suspects, of the crime scenes, so I'm basically just winging it with generic stuff. Sorry. On July 13th, 1968, a 26-year-old office worker in Adachi, which is in Tokyo, was found sexually assaulted, murdered, and her corpse was burnt. January 26th, 1973, a 22-year-old woman was found in her apartment in Kita. She was strangled to death and burned. February 1973, an apartment in Suganami, it was found on fire and there were 2 victims inside. A 22-year-old man and a 67-year-old woman. Both of their bodies had been burned as well. June of 1974 in Matsudo, a 30-year-old housewife would disappear and then her body would be found about a month and a half later. She was strangled to death. July of 1974, also in Matsudo, a 19-year-old woman would disappear after leaving a bank. Her body was found about a month later in a landfill. She had been strangled to death. July 10th, 1974, also in Matsudo. A 21-year-old teacher was found strangled to death, and also her corpse was burned. July 24th, 1974, a 22-year-old pharmacist who lived near Soka University, she was found in her apartment sexually assaulted, strangled, and burned. August 6, 1974, back in Adachi, a 24-year-old woman was found in her work office, strangled to death, and burned, and sexually assaulted. And finally, August 9th, 1974, a 21-year-old woman was found sexually assaulted, strangled, and burned in her apartment in Shiki. The MO across all of these murders was essentially the same. Most of them were sexually assaulted, most of them had been strangled to death, and most of their bodies had been burned. One consistent name came up in the investigation, and that was of Etsuyo Ono, a career criminal who had committed theft, arson, breaking and entering, attempted sexual assaults, and he was very familiar with all of the areas the murders took place. Witnesses also saw Ono leaving many of these crime scenes, but there was never any physical evidence to connect him to them. At one point, he confessed to one of them, the July 10th murder in Matsudo. He would be convicted, but then that would be overturned, because he was tortured into a confession. Literally. He was retried in 1991 where he was acquitted. But then in 1996, he actually murders a woman in Adachi, with proof this time. He's now serving life in prison, so... Hello, true crimers. This is the case of Richard Oland. Viewer discretion is advised. Richard Oland was a very rich man, a millionaire from New Brunswick, Canada. He had an estate worth $35 million. He owned investment firms, trucking companies. He came from a very wealthy family who owned a brewery. One of Richard's company, called Far End Enterprises, was housed on the second floor of this building. This is basically his main hub. It's where he did all his business from. On the morning of July 7th, 2011, his personal assistant would notice that the door to the office was cracked open, which is extremely unusual. She said she noticed what she called a vile odor. As she continued to walk inside the office, she found the body of her boss lying face down in a pool of blood. Richard was deceased, and it would be determined that he had about 45 different blows to his head. He also had some defense wounds on his hands. Now, the amount of hits to his head would indicate that this was probably a crime of passion, so someone he knew probably did this. And there was blood everywhere. This was an extremely bloody crime scene. People in the offices below report they heard a loud thud somewhere between 7:30 p.m. and 8 p.m. the night before. Richard's cell phone also appeared to be missing, and his phone had received a text somewhere around 6:44 p.m. But police would determine it pinged off a tower away from his office. The issue, though, is that that tower was omnidirectional, meaning there was no way of knowing if it came from north of the tower, west, east, whatever the case may be. Then they look into who was the last person to see Richard. The answer to that was his son, Dennis Oland. Dennis went to his father's office around 5:30 p.m. and said he left somewhere around 6:30 p.m. Then camera footage would show Dennis at a convenience store at 7:30 p.m. Police would interview Dennis, and they basically told him halfway through, "We know you did it, we think you did it, so just tell us you did it and why." He was like, but I didn't do it, I didn't kill my father. Police would then get a warrant to search Dennis's home. They really didn't find much of anything except a brown blazer that apparently had tiny little blood drops on it. And police would claim that that blood came from Richard. But Dennis had already told them prior that he had worn a navy blazer when he was meeting his father that night. But again, they searched his house, they searched his car, they found literally nothing. No blood, nothing to indicate that he was guilty of anything. Oh, and there was a boot print left behind, by the way. That boot print did not match Dennis's shoe size. And the print was over dried blood, which means it was left by someone who was likely the killer. It should also be noted that police did a horrible job when it came to securing the crime scene. They were touching things without gloves. They were walking throughout the crime scene without the proper, material on their feet. They were using a washroom inside Richard's office that could have contained evidence, but they were using it for their own personal use. And they just blatantly did not investigate anyone else other than Dennis. What would Dennis's motive be? Well, money. Police had theorized that he went there to ask his father for, a large amount of money to bail him out because he was in debt. And his father said, no, I'm not doing this anymore, so he killed him. He also thought his father thought of him as a disappointment. So, police arrested him 2 years after the murder, charged him with the murder. He went to trial, and a jury of his peers found him guilty, sentenced him to life in prison with a minimum period of 10 years before he could ask for parole. But in 2016, he was granted a retrial. This was because the judge made an error in the original case. So then his second trial ended in a mistrial, because essentially there was kind of a form of jury tampering. So then he was awarded a third trial, which would be a judge-only trial with no jury. In this trial, a witness came forward to say that they were at a restaurant across the street from the building. They said that someone left the building in a hurry between 7:40 p.m. and 8:30 p.m. Not to mention the sounds of thuds that were heard from the floor below between 7:30 and 8 p.m., where Dennis was confirmed on footage to not be anywhere near his father's office at that exact time. The cell phone ping at 6:44 p.m., that honestly became irrelevant because there was no way of knowing what direction it came from. The minuscule microscopic blood drops on the blazer, they did match Richard's blood. The explanation for that? Don't know. All they really had was circumstantial evidence with confirmation that Dennis was nowhere near the crime scene when the murder likely happened, and almost no physical evidence placing Dennis there. So this time, his third trial, the judge trial, he was found not guilty. And now he cannot be retried again. Basically, it's their double jeopardy laws like we have. So what does that mean? Who killed Richard? Don't know. Police the investigation from the beginning. His murder is unsolved and likely will never be solved, unless someone confesses. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of Tami Jackson. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, I cannot find a lot of detailed information about this case. It did not appear to have gotten any, national attention. So I'm, piecing together what I can find from different articles, and then there's a Facebook page dedicated to her. So, in 1994, Tami Jackson was a 17-year-old girl who was living in Savannah, Georgia. She was specifically staying over here on Hutchinson Island, which is across from downtown Savannah. Tammy's sister would describe her as a sweet, bubbly girl who could just get along with anyone. She was incredibly kind-hearted and wouldn't hurt a fly. But sadly, someone would want to hurt her. On January 26, 1994, construction workers would find a body. The body was that of a young female, and it was found in a desolate location here on Hutchinson Island. It would quickly be identified as that of Tami Jackson. She had been stabbed over 130 different times. Not only that, but to add insult to injury, they ran her over with a car at least a couple of times. When someone is stabbed that many times, it's typically that of a crime of passion, meaning the person who did it likely knew Tami. And this person was just really taking out some aggression. But the unfortunate thing is they never really developed any suspects. From what I read in one article, according to her sister, she had been staying with some friends at an apartment, and I guess the night she was killed, essentially, there was some sort of argument, so she kind of just left the apartment and went to go on a walk to clear her head. But in terms of any of them being suspects or naming any suspects, that's never been made public. Police may very well have a suspect, but they're just keeping it to themselves. Something that's pretty common, actually. That way people don't, flee. But unfortunately, that's it. That's the whole story that I have to tell you. The only update I've seen came from this year, 2022, where DNA they found from the crime scene that wasn't hers. They're planning to run through the system to see if it matches anyone that's already in the system. Obviously, back in 1994, when this occurred, DNA testing was not where it is today, not even close. They're even trying some of the most updated DNA procedures to see if they can link it to anyone. And the most recent update was February of 2022, but from that, there is no more updates. The murderer of Tami Jackson is still out there. If you happen to know anything, please call the Savannah, Georgia Police Department. The note would read, "Have a very Merry Christmas and may you never have to buy another flashlight." And then, boom. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Wayne Greavette. Viewer discretion is advised. On a cold and rainy December 12, 1996 day in Ontario, Canada, 21-year-old Justin Greavette would go and check the family's mailbox. Inside were some letters, and there was also a package addressed to his father, Wayne. Wayne was a married 42-year-old father of two. He worked in the beverage industry, and he and his wife were actually on the verge of starting their own bottling company. But unfortunately, that would never come to be. When his son Justin brought home the package that was addressed to him, Wayne was sitting on this exact couch. The package was wrapped in a thin white paper. Wayne ripped it off, and there was a box that held a bottle of wine, but the barcode was cut out of it. The inside of the box was stuffed with like crumpled up flyers just to keep the item inside from moving around. And inside was a letter. This letter. It was someone asking if Wayne would be interested in helping them on their business. The end of the letter would read, "Didn't realize you had moved. Had some trouble finding you. Have a very Merry Christmas, and may you never have to buy another flashlight." You see, inside the box was just a flashlight. Now, Wayne's son had grabbed the flashlight and he was trying to turn it on, but nothing was happening. Then, Wayne took the flashlight and he began to try turning it on. He pressed the power button, and then, boom. It exploded in his hands, and inside was debris, nails, just random crap that just shot out from every direction, and it impaled into Wayne, and it also hit Justin. Now, Justin and the other people in the room just experienced minor injuries. Wayne was not so lucky. This is the scene after the fact. Justin called 911 saying, "There was a bomb. My dad just blew up." When police arrived at the farmhouse in Ontario, it was too late. Wayne had died. Police would analyze the letter, of course, which somehow remained intact. The company mentioned, Acton Home Products, isn't real. The address written here, also not real. It's kind of hard to tell on this photo, but after every single period, a little line would be there. This was a flaw of the typewriter that was used. But police have never been able to find out where it came from. A previous co-worker of Wayne's was considered a suspect. Ed would accuse Wayne of stealing, and their friendship ended badly. But no charges have ever been pressed, and it's still unsolved. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of, and I apologize if I say this horribly wrong, El Psicopata. Viewer discretion is advised. This story takes us to Costa Rica, which of course is in South America. El Psicopata translates to the psychopath, and that is the name that Costa Ricans have given a serial killer who has never been caught. I had some troubles finding information on this because most of the stories were told locally, so they're not in English. But I did find some articles that had a little bit of information. So between the year 1986 and around 1995, 19 people were murdered by what authorities believe is the same person. The MO appeared to be the same. The weapon of choice appeared to be the same. One of the first victims was Ligia Camacho Bermudez. She was actually just sitting on the bed in her bedroom reading a book when a gunshot came through her window and struck her through the head. Now, this one is unusual and it separates itself from the rest of the murders that would occur, because from this point moving forward, the killer would not kill people inside their homes, because all the other ones, they would be committed in like open kind of remote areas. But the one thing that did connect this person to all the other murders is the exact same caliber of bullet. The killer's primary victim were females, but he did also kill a couple of couples. So there were some male victims. All of the victims had been shot. The authorities in Costa Rica have attributed at least 19 murders to the same person. Some of the crime scenes did yield some fingerprints, but as they've never actually had any suspects in custody, they've never matched anyone. The final murder in this case came in 1995. A couple was in their Nissan vehicle, and the authorities believe, that the killer forced them out of the vehicle and walked them to the remote location where eventually their bodies were found, and the person shot them both. What is the killer's motive? It didn't really seem to be clear because there wasn't really anything stolen. Now, there have been witnesses that seen people fleeing kind of the area where these murders occurred, and a couple of witnesses came up with this composite drawing of the possible suspect, or at the very least, someone who was wanted for questioning. Medical examiners who have been asked about this says they really aren't sure if there was like a sexual motivation with this guy, because it's really unclear if any of the female victims were ever actually sexually assaulted. This could have been a thrill kill type of thing. Could be almost like a Zodiac type situation. But in 1995, the killings just stopped, and El Psicopata has never been caught. You know, sometimes, sadly, people are born into a life, but never are given the opportunity to live. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of April Lacy. Viewer discretion is advised. April was born on July 2nd, 1982 in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and she was born into a family that, quite honestly, just wasn't great. They were a family that certainly lived in poverty, and they had to kind of just find ways to make money. They would bounce around living in like motel rooms, living out of their vehicles, living on the streets. They were heavily into drugs and alcohol. They let April start smoking when she was like a young girl. April would kind of end up growing apart from the family and stayed at a friend's house a lot. She had told people that she was being physically abused by both of her parents. She was also forced by her mom to steal from grocery stores and convenience stores. She had to rummage through dumpsters to find food. And then eventually her own mother would essentially force her into prostitution. Her own mother became her pimp. At the end of September of 1996, April would finally run away from her home for good. Her parents would actually report her missing on October 3rd, 1996. And then a few days later, in Decatur, Texas, two farmers would uncover something horrific. Lying in a brush pile was a decomposed body of a young woman. She was completely nude, and police surmised that she was dumped there because her arm was like above her head, indicating that she was dragged. The decomposition was just bad enough where you could not determine who it was by appearance. At first, police just labeled her as the brush girl. And then a forensic artist took her skull and basically drew what she would have looked like. Honestly, it's pretty remarkable how close she got this drawing. Police would go through a bunch of missing persons reports, and they finally came to the conclusion that it was likely April. So police used DNA, and they finally also used dental comparisons and determined that it was in fact the body of April Lacy. She had been strangled to death. Her parents were questioned because of the lifestyle they lived, and police strongly suspect that at least her mother, because she was her pimp, she likely may know more than what she was saying. Police also believe she may have just been killed by a serial killer, but there was such little evidence left behind that they've never determined who killed her. I personally kind of feel like Mom knows more. Just an opinion. But her case is still very much unsolved. A man in Hawaii would claim that a psychic led him to one of the bodies. Police believe he was the killer. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of the Honolulu Strangler. Viewer discretion is advised. On May 29th, 1984, 25-year-old Vicky Purdy was out for a night of fun. Her husband was expecting her back sometime that night, but she never got home. He went out looking for her and found her vehicle parked exactly where she left it, but there was no sign of her. Soon after, the Honolulu Police Department would get a call that a body was found floating in the Ke'ehi Lagoon. It was the body of Vicky Purdy. Vicky had her hands tied behind her back. She was sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Her killer left virtually no evidence behind, and the case went very cold very fast. And then on January 14th, 1986, the body of 17-year-old Regina Sakamoto was found. The last time anyone heard from her, her boyfriend said she spoke to him on the phone saying she would be late for school. She was last physically seen waiting at a bus stop. She was also found floating near Ke'ehi Lagoon, hands tied behind her back, strangled, and sexually assaulted. Honolulu police believe that it's the same person who killed Vicky. 2 weeks later, the body of 21-year-old Denise Hughes is found. Her body was found in a drainage canal near Ke'ehi Lagoon. She, too, was last seen waiting at a bus stop. And the same MO with her as well. She was strangled, she was sexually assaulted. Police now believe we've got ourselves a serial killer. Then, 24-year-old Louise Medeiros would go missing. She was reported missing on March 26, 1986. She was last seen waiting on a bus stop at the Honolulu airport. Her body was found about 2 months after the third victim. She was found in the Waikele stream underneath an overpass. Sounding like a broken record here, but she too had the same, cause of death, and she was also sexually assaulted. And then on April 29th, 1986, 36-year-old Linda Pesky would be reported missing. They found her car abandoned, and some witnesses saw her at a bus stop, and there were also witnesses who saw a man near her. On May 3rd, 1986, this man walks into the Honolulu Police Department. This was 43-year-old Howard Gay. He said a psychic told him where the body of Linda Pesky was, so police followed him to where she told him it was. Sure enough, her body was found on Sand Island. Police didn't believe the story, so they arrested him. However, there was no physical evidence. He vaguely matched the description of the person at the bus stop, but police never had any evidence to charge him. Suddenly, there were no more victims. He died a free man in 2003. This is one of Britain's most notorious unsolved murders. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of Penny Bell. Viewer discretion is advised. Penny was a 43-year-old married mother of 2 children, and they lived in the Greenford area of London, England. She was a very successful businesswoman who worked at an employment agency. Her husband, Alistair Bell, was a very successful real estate agent. On the morning of Thursday, June 6, 1991, her husband would leave the house with the 2 kids around 8:30 in the morning. This was their normal routine, and also during the time they had construction people working on their home. They were doing some remodels. Alistair said that Penny seemed to be in totally good spirits, nothing unusual. The construction people said that Penny left the house about 9:40 in the morning because she had a 9:50 appointment that she was already running late to. The people working on the house said Penny appeared to be completely normal, nothing unusual, just like her husband said. The only thing odd is that she left a mess in the bathroom, which is not like her. So she might have left the house in a rush. Now, this appointment that Penny said she had, no one knew what it was. She did not write it down in any kind of diary. There was no indication anywhere of any appointment she may have had. Approximately 3 hours after she left home, her blue Jaguar JXS was discovered in a parking area, specifically the Carnell Leisure Center. Inside the car was Penny Bell. She had been murdered. She had roughly 50 different stab wounds. Her purse was still in the car with nothing taken. Now, a woman walking her dog earlier that morning said she saw a man who looked like this getting inside of a blue Jaguar around 9:50 in the morning. The person driving the car appeared to look like Penny Bell. Now, around 11 o'clock in the morning, someone saw Penny's vehicle parked where it was found with a person slumped over in the driver's seat. The witness did not approach the vehicle as they thought the person inside was just sleeping. So it's known that the murder happened sometime between 9:50 a.m. and 11 a.m. There were no witnesses to the attack itself, even though it was a very busy parking area. A neighbor man by the name of John Richmond at one point was arrested because his fingerprints were found in her car. He would claim that he was actually having an affair with Penny, and that he was in her car that morning to have a bit of a rendezvous, but then he left the car. Police have arrested him twice over the years, but they've never charged him with anything. Alistair was investigated, but he was completely cleared. He had an alibi. Penny had withdrew about £8,000 from her bank a few days prior to this. That money has never been accounted for. They know she was stabbed from the passenger seat, and this is like a crime of passion, and her daughters are still awaiting justice. A missing girl would finally be found just feet from where they found her car years prior. Hello, true crimers. This is the mysterious case of Ebby Steppach. Viewer discretion is advised. Ebby was an 18-year-old girl who lived in Little Rock, Arkansas, and she was a senior in high school. She was dating a young man named Eric, and they seemed to be in a perfectly good relationship. In October of 2015, Ebby had gone to her stepfather and said, "Hey, can you come with me to the police department because I need to report a sexual assault?" Ebby said that a couple of boys from school had sexually assaulted her and recorded it and everything. But before Ebby could ever get to the police department, she would vanish. On October 25th, 2015, she called her brother and said, "Hey, I'm outside your house. Will you come out and meet me?" And this was around 5:30 p.m. When her brother went out there, she wasn't there. She then calls him back and says, "Sorry, I'm fucked up." And then the call ends. And that was it. That was the last time anyone ever heard from her. The family reported her missing, but the police department was like, meh, she probably just ran away. Like, they just completely disregarded it. It wouldn't be until a couple days after she went missing when the police department decided to take it a little bit more seriously, because her vehicle was found at a park nearby called Chalamont Park. In the car, all of her belongings, purse, wallet, keys, everything. The keys were actually in the ignition. Now, police would do like a very general search of the park. At one point, there was the smell of decay. They even had scent dogs brought in, but they disregarded the smell of decay as just probably a dead animal, and then they just sort of left it at that. And then the case just went cold. Without Ebby, there was no validity to the story she was telling about the sexual assaults. They didn't even know who it would have been. And just to play devil's advocate, if it was real or not real. 2 years later, there was now a new detective working on the case. He decided to kind of start from square one. There was like a sewer entrance in the area, and that's kind of where the smell of decay was originally coming from. So the detective decided to do some excavation. He had a team dig up an area where the drainage pipe let out, and inside that drainage pipe, about 60 feet from where the car was found, and about 70 feet in the pipe, were the remains of Ebby Steppach. The cause of her death has never been released publicly, but the new detective said this was likely a homicide. Ebby's mom has been on it since day one, basically doing her own investigating since the police are doing very little. Because the police wanted to say that she just did it herself, but the family doesn't buy that, and honestly doesn't make much sense. Her boyfriend thinks that she might have died accidentally around some friends, and that they hid her body in the pipe, but her case is still unsolved. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of Virginia Olson. Viewer discretion is advised. By 1973, Virginia was a 19-year-old drama student, and she did so at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. Virginia was described as someone who had kind of like a soft personality, very quiet, but she was also just always very happy. She was always very engaged in school, and people said she had a smile that could light up a room. On Sunday, April 15th, 1973, Virginia, who actually went by Ginger to all of her friends, she and another student of hers left their dorm room at around 12 o'clock. Ginger decided she was going to do some studying in a quiet little area of the nearby Asheville Botanical Gardens. Back in 1973, this was a place that students would go to study, to make out, to smoke a little stuff. But this was an area where you could find a very secluded spot to kind of just relax and, study. And that's what Ginger was doing. Just a few hours later, at 3:30 p.m., two high school students would be walking through the Botanical Gardens, and they stumbled into a living nightmare. It was the body of Ginger Olson. She was lying on her back. She was partially clothed. Her t-shirt was ripped off of her and then shredded into pieces, and then her assailant basically bound her with pieces of her own shirt. Her jeans were taken off and folded and placed kind of neatly next to her. Her tennis shoes were just thrown off, the laces were taken out of it, and she had at least one stab wound to her neck and one directly into her heart. The coroner would also determine that she was, in fact, sexually assaulted. The campus would be notified later that evening, and police would question hundreds of students, in particular the male students, but ultimately police came up with absolutely nothing. You know, this is in 1973. They collected, they said, a ton of evidence, but they also didn't really know what DNA was back then. I can't find if there was like any kind of DNA like left, you know, in Ginger or on her. But it is reported that they do still have all of the evidence they had collected back then. But a lot of people have described this as cold of a case as you could possibly get. Because of the lack of evidence, there was zero witness testimony. No one saw a thing, no one heard a thing. There were rumors of like an escaped mental institution patient, but that didn't really come out to be anything either. This happened during the Watergate scandal, so this barely made the news. And to this very day, nobody knows who killed Virginia Ginger Olson. Disappearing off a cruise ship just seems baffling to me. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Tammy Grogan. Viewer discretion is advised. Tammy Grogan was a single mother living in Toledo, Ohio, and she had a 14-year-old son named Jimmy. Okay, so this is where it gets kind of convoluted. So Tammy's Aunt Deb, who Tammy hadn't seen for a very long time, kind of came back into her life. One day, Deb gets a phone call from a young man that she used to babysit. That man was 25-year-old Craig Morgan. Tammy said, "Hey Deb, why don't you go ahead and invite your friend over?" So she did. Now, this is when Jimmy was a little bit younger, but Jimmy and this new person, Craig Morgan, they struck up a really quick friendship for some reason. Craig Morgan had a lot of money. How he had all that money, no one really truly seems to know. Craig would shower Jimmy with gifts, as well as Tammy, as well as Deb. But it got to a point where Tammy was like, "I'm really uncomfortable with how close you are to my son." Understandably. So Tammy would tell Craig that, "Hey, listen, you can't be a part of his life anymore. We're going to need to kind of like separate us from you." Craig apparently wasn't super happy about that. But at some point, Craig purchases tickets to a carnival cruise called Imagination. He himself doesn't go on the cruise, but he invites Tammy and Jimmy and Deb to go on the cruise. So, Jimmy, Deb, Tammy, Tammy's mother, they go on the cruise. Unbeknownst to them, Craig also gave tickets to two other people. His own sister, Rebecca Morgan. Rebecca also had her ex-boyfriend. His name is Robert Pantoja. Despite all of this, everyone seems to be having a great time on the cruise. Tammy was last seen at approximately 1:30 a.m. on September 10th on the cruise. When they went to her cabin the next day, she wasn't there. Tammy's mom wakes up the next day really groggy, not sure how she even got to her own bed that night, but she's not a drinker, so she was very confused. Now, they claim that Tammy must have just found herself a guy on the ship and she'll come back later, but she never did. And it took them 24 hours to report that she was missing. A thorough search of the ship, she was gone. When the FBI got involved, they noticed there was a glass in Tammy's room, so they checked it. In that glass were traces of Rohypnol, otherwise known as the date rape drug. After Jimmy gets back to his apartment he shared with his mother, he noticed it was broken into and items were stolen. Police would investigate Craig Morgan's house. They found some of the stolen items in his home. But again, he was not on the cruise. Tammy was eventually declared dead, but she's never been found. And nobody has been arrested. But the family thinks Craig orchestrated her murder. 2 people killed in broad daylight, and the answers are still unknown. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Carnell Sledge and Katherine Brown. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, there really isn't a whole lot of information to provide about this case, but Carnell Sledge was 40 years old and Katherine Brown was 33. The two of them had been good friends for the past 10 years or so, and they lived in the Rocky River, Ohio area. On June 4th, 2019, the two friends would meet here at this park. This is at the Rocky River Reservation, and it's near the Lorraine Bridge. Authorities know that around 5:04 p.m., the two of them arrived at this park and sat down on this very bench. At some point between 5:08 p.m. and 5:14 p.m., both of them would be shot in the back of the head and killed. Katherine's body was found floating in the water near the bridge, and Carnell's body was found near the bench just on the ground. At 5:18 p.m., two kayakers would come across their bodies. Police would realize this was obviously not an accidental shooting. This was a deliberate attack on the two of them. However, they do not know if they were actually targeted by anyone specifically, or if this was just a very random shooting. And unfortunately, that's all the information I have. There is very little information released to the public. There is, from my understanding, no real evidence to work off of. There are no witnesses who have come forward. So all we have is two people who were shot dead for no apparent reason. So authorities in the Rocky River, Ohio area are asking for your help. I'm going to put the phone number in the comments below. You may have to remind me if I forget, but apparently I'm not allowed to put public phone numbers on the screen. It's why I was absent the past 3 days. But if you have any information that could help authorities and their families solve this case, please give that phone number a call. Just in case, you can contact the Cleveland FBI or the Metro Parks Police Department or Crime Stoppers. You can report information anonymously, so if you don't want to be known, that's okay. But any little thing can help, so please give them a call. This is considered Scotland's most mysterious unsolved crimes, and something they would call one of the most baffling murder cases of modern times. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Alistair Wilson. Viewer discretion is advised. Alistair was a 30-year-old father of two children, and they lived in Nairn in Scotland. And Alistair was the business manager at the Bank of Scotland. By literally everyone's account, Alistair is a wonderful man, a phenomenal father, a loving husband. He does his job and does it really well. He is a nice guy, and there's just nothing bad you can say about him. Alistair didn't have any enemies, he didn't ruffle any feathers, he was just a guy living his family life. And then, November 28th, 2004 came, and the mystery would begin. At approximately 7 p.m. that day, Alistair was upstairs in his home as he was reading bedtime stories to his two boys. The doorbell rang, and his wife, Veronica, would go answer it, and then a man who was wearing a baseball cap, a dark blue jacket, and dark jeans would ask specifically for Alistair Wilson. So Veronica calls for him, and he comes down. When he opens the door, the man gives him a blue envelope, and it has the name Paul written on the front. Alistair then walks to his wife, hands her the envelope, and then he goes back towards the door. And then, boom, gunshots rang out. Veronica runs to the door. Alistair has been shot 3 times, and the mystery man is gone. Detectives at first begin to question, his wife, because usually that's the first person you go to. But, she's completely cleared of any wrongdoing. Well, then maybe his bank job, because he has a high position in the bank, so maybe he pissed someone off and he didn't know it, and then this was the end result. Well, they looked into that too. They found really nothing nefarious. They found no suspicious activity from his job. He was just clean as a whistle at work. So police released the description of the killer, the little description they have. They first described him as kind of a heavier set guy, but I guess later that would change to he was actually more of a thinner guy and younger. On December 8th, 2004, as police are still kind of investigating the home and around the home, they notice in a drainage ditch a gun. I can't show the whole thing because, but they found this weapon inside that drainage ditch just outside the home of Alistair. It was a German-made handgun that basically could fit the palm of your hand. Tiny little thing. It was a pocket pistol that was made in the 20s and the 30s. And it used .25 caliber bullets. Now, the blue envelope did appear to have some DNA on it because the police have DNA evidence in this case, and they've actually run that DNA against well over 1,000 different people, and they've never gotten a match. But they were just completely baffled. There was no reason for this to have happened. You could say it could have been a random killing, but the guy asked for Alistair Wilson specifically. He said his full name, so whoever the shooter was knew him, or at least knew his name. And he deliberately handed him an envelope with the name Paul on it, which, by the way, Paul had no connection to anyone in Alistair's life. The case went cold. I mean, ice cold. They had no idea why this happened. There was literally no reason for this to have happened. No motive. Nothing. Nada. Zilch. It was a complete conundrum. Until about 2022. This year. Pictured here is the Havelock Hotel, and it was literally right across the road from where Alistair and his family lived. Police would uncover something just literally this year, or towards the end of 2021. Alistair Wilson had filed a complaint, I guess, against the hotel. So this is where it is. So the hotel wanted to build a deck and expand the property. Alistair said it's already noisy enough, so he said, I'm going to object to this since it's right by my home. Well, then witnesses came forward very recently that said in the hotel itself, people were openly talking about Alistair complaining about this deck. And then it was starting to spread around a nearby bar. People were talking about it back in 2004 when this murder happened. So the owner of the hotel from back then, he now lives in Canada, and police from Scotland have now traveled to Canada to question him. By the way, the decking that he objected, it would end up being built. So the hotel knew of his objection. And then 2 days after they hear about this objection, he's mysteriously shot on his own doorstep. The original owner of the hotel had connections with a guy that may fit the description of who shot him, but this guy would have been much younger and much thinner than he was described as. But that's all there is right now. No one's been arrested, no one's been charged. They haven't even confirmed it's about the hotel. So this is still a crazy mystery. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of Diane Schofield. Viewer discretion is advised. Diane was born on November 1st, 1953, and lived in Des Moines, Iowa. By 1975, she was a 21-year-old mother of a 5-year-old daughter, and she was working 2 jobs to kind of help support herself and her child. On the afternoon of July 10th, 1975, there was a 1966 Rambler parked at a parking lot of a steakhouse restaurant. The maintenance person who worked there said that there was a very foul odor coming from the vehicle and that it had been parked there for at least a couple of days. So they would call police, who would come and they would have to pry the trunk open. Inside was the body of Diane Schofield. She was fully clothed. She had on no shoes, however. She had her hands tied behind her back, and her feet were tied together at the ankles. There was a strip of cloth around her neck, which would be determined to be the murder weapon, as it was determined that she had been strangled to death. They were able to quickly rule out robbery, as her purse was still in the vehicle and she was still wearing a very expensive watch. Now, originally, the coroner said that she had likely been dead for 6 days, but then witness statements would come out completely saying that could not be possible. You see, Diane was last seen alive at a gas station sometime around 9 p.m. on July 7th, 1975, just 3 days prior to her being found. The sort of stranger thing, though, is that she was really last seen by her friends and family on July 4th, 1975. Diane and her sister Twyla had gone out to a lake to celebrate the holiday, and there were plenty of other people there too, friends and family. But Diane had left early so that she could go to her job. Twyla didn't hear from Diane, though, over the next couple of days, and then they would find out that her roommate said she hadn't come home at all. So her roommates actually reported her missing on July 10th. And then a few hours later, her car was found with her body inside of it. Yes, it was her car. But there's really no one that can say they saw her between July 4th and July 7th. But the confirmed sighting on July 7th was official. So the coroner would end up redoing the time of death after re-examining her and determine that she was in fact killed sometime on July 7th after about 10 p.m. But there has been no suspects. The killer left no fingerprints, no DNA, no hair, nothing. And this is a mystery. She had no enemies. If you have information, contact the Des Moines Police Department. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of Robin Stone. Viewer discretion is advised. Robin was born on January 12, 1974, and her family lived in Cambridge, Ohio. She had a kid sister named Jamie that she loved dearly. They were like the best of friends. Robin was someone who absolutely adored animals. She adored all wildlife. She actually had a passion and a dream to go to veterinary school at some point in her life. She also had a side dream job of working in sports medicine. She was very athletic and she loved all of that kind of stuff too. Robin was also a pretty popular girl around school. Most people knew her. Now, in 1990 and 1991, Robin had kind of dated a couple of guys off and on. You know, it's like high school, teenagers, that whole thing. And at one point, she actually got pregnant. At the time, they weren't sure who the father of the baby was. Robin thought the father of the baby was possibly Lee Savage, someone that she had actually been dating for the longest amount of time. They had a very rocky relationship. They broke up many times, got back together, but Lee always denied being the father and denied even having slept with her. This was during a time when DNA paternity testing was not such a huge thing yet, so they didn't really have the ability to really test. On the afternoon of August 27th, 1991, Robin would get home from school, and this was sometime around 3 p.m. And then while at home, she received a phone call. Robin's mother recalls hearing her say on the phone, "Okay, I'll be right there," and then she hung up. She said she was going over to her friend Jody's house, and that she would be back before dinner. But 6 p.m. came along, and she still wasn't home. So her mom would call Jody's house, and Jody said, "We didn't have plans to meet up. She hasn't come over here at all today." So then Robin's mom realized, okay, she lied about where she was going. But then she's still missing. No one knows where she is. It turns into like the following day. She's still not home, so she's reported missing. And they search and search and search for her, but they don't find her anywhere. They're worried because she is 7 months pregnant and she did not have any of her prenatal pills with her. On December 28th, 1991, 2 hunters would come across the body of Robin Stone. She was found in Luberg Lake, and it was mainly skeletal remains. And they also confirmed it was her because there was a fetus inside. Her remains had no obvious injuries, so they could not totally determine her cause of death because there was no, breakage of bones, no gunshots, no stab marks. So they think suffocation was how she probably died. So police now need to circle back and again try to find out who it was that Robin was supposed to be meeting that afternoon. I don't really have many other photos, so I'm sorry about that. But they did want to question all of the boys that she had been dating. And, pretty much all of them they were able to clear. There was one red flag, though, and that would be Lee Savage, the boy that she thought was the father. Well, apparently Lee's father, Jack, did not think very highly of Robin. He thought that Robin and her family were like lower class, white trash type people. And that his son was way too good for anyone like her. and there's no way she would be pregnant with his baby. Whenever police talked to either Lee or Jack, they were pretty aggressive, it seemed like. However, at one point, Lee said, "I think my dad could possibly be the father of the baby." Okay, that seems completely out of nowhere, but okay. The other red flag with Lee is that where she was found was a place that she loved to go to with Lee. It was like a hangout spot for them. But there was no physical evidence to connect Lee or Jack or anyone to her murder. Even though circumstantial evidence is kind of like, okay, well, clearly she got pregnant with Lee's baby and they couldn't have that, so... But they couldn't arrest anyone or accuse anyone or anything. Many years later, this case would be featured on Cold Justice, and they would finally get a DNA test and confirmed that the father of the baby was Lee Savage. He then kind of reversed his story and said, okay, yeah, we did have sex a couple of times, but I didn't kill her. But even with that paternity test, essentially, it's still not proof that he or his father had anything to do with her murder. Even though, like, let's be real here. We've seen this exact scenario play out before. Clearly, Jack thought very low of her. And he couldn't be tied up with, like, her family and, you know, their higher class family. I don't know. It seems like maybe Jack and Lee did something together. I don't know. That seems like the likeliest scenario, though. She left her house and was found at the lake, where her and Lee always met up. The baby is Lee's. Lee's constantly denying it was his. Lee's daddy's like, don't involve her in our lives. 1 + 1 is 2, my friends. But sadly, I have no resolutions for you at this time. Her murder is still technically unsolved because they have no physical evidence. This is one of those scenarios where a confession may be the only thing that gets a conviction. This is one of the most unsettling murder cases I've talked about recently. It's just eerie. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of Dorothy Jane Scott. Viewer discretion is advised. Dorothy was described as a very, vivacious, very full of life, full of energy type person. She was a 32-year-old single mother of 1 child living in Stanton, California. And that's within the vicinity of Anaheim, California. A couple of weeks or so before this case takes place, Dorothy started getting some very disturbing phone calls. It was a guy's voice, and Dorothy would describe them as very terrifying calls. Now, she did not know who the guy was, but she said the voice did sound kind of familiar, but she couldn't put it on anyone. One call she got, the man said, "When I get you alone, I will cut you up into bits so no one else will have you." The man would tell her, "I'm always watching you. I always know where you are." One day he told her to look outside at her car, and on her windshield was a dead rose. He said it was a gift for you. Obviously, this troubled Dorothy. She started taking karate lessons, and she was thinking about purchasing a gun. On the night of May 28th, 1980, while at an employee meeting for her work, she noticed one of her coworkers had a very distinguished red mark on his arm. It looked like a bite, and this coworker, he wasn't feeling good. She offered to take him to the hospital, and along with another coworker, that's what they did. She dropped her coworkers off at the hospital, she went home to go check on her son real quick, and then she came back to the hospital. Turns out her coworker was bitten by a black widow spider. But he was treated, everything was going to be okay, he just needed to wait for a prescription. So Dorothy said, "Let me go get the car, I'll pull it up to the front so you don't have to walk very far." Around 11 p.m., her 2 coworkers were now waiting by the entrance, when all of a sudden her car comes speeding towards them, and then the car turns right, and then she's gone. Dorothy is never seen again. She was reported missing. The following morning, her car was found abandoned and on fire, but Dorothy was nowhere near it. And then, more phone calls, this time to Dorothy's family, saying, "Are you Dorothy's family? Well, I've got her." And then every single Wednesday, he would call the house to report that either he still had her or that he killed her. And he would always hang up before the call could be traced. Several years later, on August 6, 1984, her skeletal remains would be found. She was so badly decomposed, the cause of death was not known. Mixed with her bones were the bones of a dog. The mystery man would call to say, "I killed her." He taunted them, but he has never been caught. One Friday the 13th in California, a man would be shot dead in his own home, and the only witness would give multiple different stories. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of William Bud Roberts. Viewer discretion is advised. William would go by Bud, and he was a very charismatic, very fun, very funny, just loving individual. Everyone adored him. He would do anything for you. Bud was a bank manager, and he was a loving father of 2 now adult children from a previous marriage. Pictured here was his current wife, I guess you could say, Sue. Pretty quickly after Bud announced he was divorcing his previous wife, Sue came ringing the doorbell because they used to date. This woman wasted no time. Now, like I said, Bud had 2 children, and very recently before this story began, his daughter Lauren had tragically died in a car accident. Her sudden death just was a tragedy that destroyed the family. And Sue, well, she would make it even worse, because Sue began to take out credit cards in Lauren's name. And Sue began racking up debt and just buying a whole bunch of useless crap, and she used Lauren's old room to fill with all of that crap. When Bud found out, he was absolutely livid. This would create an obvious rift in their marriage, but he stuck with her. On Friday, July 13th, 2007, Bud would get a phone call from his son, Brian. Guess what? Someone took out a credit card in his name. So Bud confronts Sue about it. She said, "Oh, it's a misunderstanding. No, I was buying stuff for the office with the business card." And then, 6 hours later, Sue calls 911 in an absolute panic, saying that her husband had just been shot in bed. He is airlifted to a hospital down in San Diego, where his family is alerted and they all rush there immediately, as quick as they can. Except for Sue. No, she takes a shower and then just casually gets ready and drives down to the hospital. The family asks Sue, what the hell happened? First she says Bud did it to himself. He was just so distraught over Lauren's death. And then she changes her story. Oh, Bud was cleaning his gun and he accidentally shot himself. Except Bud was taught very strict gun safety by his father, and he knew exactly how to do it safely. And then she says, oh, someone broke into the house and just shot him. The problem, Sue, is there's no sign of forced entry. Nothing is stolen. There is no sign of an altercation. The only one in the room with him? Sue, that's it. But police have not announced her as a suspect. But all signs point to Sue. And that's it. That's where we're left. This is still unsolved. We screwed it up from the beginning, police would say. And honestly, that's probably why this case has never been solved. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of the Burger Chef murders. Viewer discretion is advised. It was a busy day at the Burger Chef in Speedway, Indiana. It was November 17th, 1978. The busy day would finally wind down to a quiet evening. Working that evening was 20-year-old assistant manager Jane Freet and her 3 employees, 18-year-old Ellen Shelton and 16-year-olds Daniel Davis and Mark Flemons. They were just cleaning up the restaurant and getting ready to leave for the night. Sometime after midnight, an employee of the Burger Chef who wasn't working that day happened to be passing by. They noticed that the lights inside the restaurant was still on, so they pulled into the parking lot and noticed the back door was cracked open. Something that is actually extremely unusual for them, as they never have that door open. When police arrived, everything in the restaurant appeared to be completely normal. There was no sign of a struggle, but all of the employees were gone. Some of the belongings, like purses and keys, were left behind, but missing from the restaurant safe was about $550 or so. So police basically came to the conclusion that the 4 employees just embezzled from the store and took off. They thought this because the manager's car was also gone. The following morning, they allowed the employees to come in and clean up the place, meaning they wiped down every surface. They used chemicals to clean up. All of the garbage was thrown away, meaning they got rid of every piece of possible evidence. Later that same day, they would find the manager's car abandoned. The doors were partially opened, no one was around. That's when police said, uh-oh, I think we screwed this up. Yeah, no shit. By cleaning up the entire restaurant, you got rid of every trace of the people who may have kidnapped these 4 people. They also took no pictures. They took one photo of the inside after everything was cleaned. Just a couple of days later, in a desolate area, the bodies of all 4 individuals would be found next to each other. They had all been shot dead, and one of them was stabbed so badly they had the knife still stuck in their chest. The blade is the only piece of evidence that they have. A witness would come forward saying they think they saw 2 men near the restaurant, so they gave descriptions of those men. So these are composite drawings. They then made these horrifying clay sculptures of them. Look at his eyes. The case obviously went cold as they had no evidence. In 1984, an inmate at a local prison, he would confess. His name was Donald Forrester. He would come forward to police one day to admit that he was in Speedway, Indiana, the night of the Burger Chef murders, and that he was one of the killers. Now, he also provided information about the murders that were pretty credible. He knew about the blade being stuck in one of their chests, something the police had not really released yet. He knew which victims were shot. He told police exactly where the bodies were found. He made the claim that Jane Freet's brother owed him money, so he went to the Burger Chef basically to collect his money from the sister. And one of them, Mark, he was hit and he was knocked unconscious. So then I guess they freaked out, and then they loaded up everyone in their vehicle by gunpoint, brought them to the remote location, and felt they needed to kill all of them because now they were witnesses to a potential crime. And like I had said, all of the information he was telling police was extremely credible. He was, again, pointing out things that no one should have known, unless they were there, unless they were the killers. Police were trying to get his accomplices out of him. But then it was leaked that this guy was talking to police, that he was now a police informant. So Donald Forrester said, I'm done with you guys. He never spoke a word about it again. They never pressed charges against him. He never gave up his accomplice. He then would die in prison. Was he the killer? Was he the real deal? It's not known. The restaurant would eventually close. It became a desolate wasteland. I think it's now demolished, but I'm not 100% sure on that. There has been no other suspects, no other witnesses have come forward, and now to this very day, this case is unsolved, and it has gone extremely cold. One can't help but wonder, had police actually treated the restaurant as a crime scene from the get-go, we might have a different resolution to this. But unfortunately, we will never know. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of Jeffrey Ben. Viewer discretion is advised. Jeffrey was an 18-year-old who lived in the Clayton, Oklahoma area. Jeffrey was considered someone who was very outgoing and everyone loved him. He's just someone who had a really positive attitude, and his little brothers really looked up to him. He would do this at school where he would show off his little brothers because that's how proud of them he was. His mom said that anytime he came into her work, he would give everyone there a hug. Jeffrey was also absolutely infatuated with sports. He knew every stat of every player, and he wanted to become a sportscaster after going to college. But unfortunately, that would not get to happen. On January 29th, 2001, it was Super Bowl Sunday, he was allegedly over at some relative's house watching the game. He was at his uncle's house on Pine Road in the Tuscaloosa area. Shortly after 1 a.m., he left his uncle's house, and about 15-20 minutes later, neighbors would report hearing the sound of a car striking a tree. When people went out to look, it was Jeffrey's truck. It was a very minor, fender bender, kind of just sort of casually crashed into a tree. But the thing is, Jeffrey wasn't in the truck. And by the way, this is not an image of his truck. There was no blood in the vehicle, so it did not appear that he had injured himself. But again, he was just gone. He wasn't there. At a later date, the sheriff would come out and say that they don't even know if Jeffrey was in the truck when this happened. But they searched all over the wooded area his car was found in. They searched his uncle's neighborhood, the surrounding neighborhoods. Again, nothing. Where the hell did he go? He was reported missing. They would search by land. They would search by air. They would use cadaver dogs. Nothing. Nothing at all. Police in the meantime would question his uncle and cousins who were at the house that night. And allegedly, one of his cousins failed a polygraph test with regards to his disappearance. What to make of that? It's unclear. March 23rd, 2006, roughly 5 years later, in a wooded area near Clayton, 2 loggers who were working in that area found skeletal remains. The remains would be identified as Jeffrey Benn, and the case from there would be investigated as a homicide. Again, these are not his actual remains. At one point, a person came by with a tip saying he witnessed Jeffrey be murdered and also being disposed of, but I don't believe that checked out because no one was ever arrested. The uncle reportedly changed his story a few times with regards to when Jeffrey was at his home. The sheriff involved in investigating his case, Elvin Flood, after he retired, he took files of his back home illegally. Why? And this is still unsolved. Something terrible has happened. I cannot tell you right now what it is, but I will tell you when I get home. The author of this note, she never made it home. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of Carina Holmer. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, Carina was from Stockholm, Sweden, and she had a dream to come to America. And that dream would come to fruition for her. She ended up winning the equivalent of $1,500 US dollars by doing like one of those scratch-off tickets. So, in March of 1996, she traveled to America, specifically Boston, Massachusetts. She quickly got a job. She was actually working for a photographer. The photographer was named Frank Rapp, and him and his wife and his kids lived in this little community here, and Carina would live there with them part-time. And the other half of her time, she was living in his photography studio. She was a nanny for the kids, so that's what she did for them. On the late evening of June 21st, 1996, she would go out to Zanzibar, which was a nightclub in the Boston Common area. She was there with a couple of her friends that she had made over the past couple months. This is actually a photo of her from that evening. At approximately 3:20 a.m., she was seen leaving Zanzibar, but she never got home to either of her homes that she had there, and she would then be reported missing later that same day. It wouldn't be long until she was found. About a 45-minute walk away from where she was last seen, this is CCTV footage of police officers looking through a dumpster. The reason they are doing that is because the following afternoon from her disappearance, the upper half of her body was found. She had been severed in half with some sort of saw, and they never found her lower half, even to this day. Police searched and dug through the dumpsters for any other evidence, but they never found anything. As a matter of fact, whatever evidence police may have collected, they have kept it pretty hush-hush. For example, nobody knows if there was any foreign DNA left behind. Fingerprints, hair samples, no one knows. While investigating Carina's background, a friend of hers would come forward with a note that Carina had given her just a few days prior to her death. The note read, "Something terrible has happened. I cannot tell you right now what it is, but I will tell you when I get home." And by home, she's talking about Sweden. She was actually planning to cut her trip short because she had recently become kind of unhappy, but no one knows what this terrible thing is she's referring to. Her cause of death was she was strangled, but that's all we know. To this day, her case is still very much unsolved. The body of a homeless man would be found scattered in several different locations in Minneapolis. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of Adam Richard Johnson. Viewer discretion is advised. From the various articles I've read, Adam Johnson is consistently described almost as if he's two different people. There's clean and sober Adam, and then there's not clean and sober Adam. When he was sober, he was considered a loving, caring, doting father. But when he wasn't, he was belligerent and, a bit of an issue with the law. Nothing serious. One time he was arrested for throwing feces at people. And this was during a time when he was both high and also drunk. He had an on-again, off-again relationship with a woman that has asked to be named JoJo. She was the mother of his child, and she cared for Adam very much, and she is just wanting answers to what happened to him. On June 17th, 2021, a man would walk out of his home and see a clear bag, and when he looked in the bag, he made a horrific discovery. There were several body parts inside of it. Police were called immediately. And then a little bit down the street from there, a woman discovered a human leg that had been chopped up into pieces and displayed for people to see. 5 days later, it got worse. At about 6:15 in the morning, a person walking through a park discovered a partially thawed human head, and carved into the head was the word perv. The body parts would be confirmed to belong to 36-year-old man Adam Johnson. He had recently been homeless, and clearly someone had a grudge against him. The people in his life do not believe that this was some sort of drug-related thing. They believe that this was a personal attack on him because they wanted to do this to him. Who that person is, it's not known. Police consider this to be a premeditated attack because they had the thought of freezing the head first. No one really knows why the word perv was cut into his forehead, or no one's released that information. There was DNA left under his fingernails that police have still tried to match to someone, but they have not been lucky on that yet. Adam's cause of death is not known because he was dismembered. His body would be found in at least 4 different locations. JoJo said he was a human being, and he did not deserve this. But sadly, this is still unsolved. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of Yolanda Bendix. Viewer discretion is advised. Yolanda was a 25-year-old mother of 4 children living in the Jamestown, New York area. She was someone who was described as a person that would always put family first. She adored her children, and she was just a very outgoing person. Yolanda worked at a Family Dollar store, and that is where she was on the night of August 10th, 2004. That night, the store closed at 8 p.m., and by 8:20, her and her coworker had locked up the building and left for the evening. She had called her brother, who was watching her kids at the time, that she was going to run by the store real quick, and then she would be on her way home. And that was the last time anyone ever heard from her again, because she never got home. Obviously, this concerned her family, and by the following morning, they would report her missing. The following day, around 7 p.m., her car was found in the parking lot of this Arby's, which wasn't too far away from the Family Dollar. As a matter of fact, it was on the same road. But Yolanda was not there, and none of her belongings were in the vehicle. In September of 2004, so about a month later, her keys and her wallet were found in a ditch, and they were only about a mile away from where the Family Dollar store was. But still, no indication of where Yolanda had gone. Were there suspects in this? Yes, there were a couple. One of them was a man that she had previously been in a relationship with and was the father of one of her children, and his name is Carl Carty. However, police have not been able to connect him physically to her disappearance. Another possible suspect was a Jamestown police officer by the name of Michael Watson. He too had a previous relationship with Yolanda, and he was not very forthcoming with information with regards to that relationship. He would later be accused of harassing and stalking other women and would even be charged and go to court for those. But again, no physical evidence connecting him to the disappearance of Yolanda. Her family continued to search, but for 2 years they would have nothing. And then on September 10th, 2006, hunters in this area of Jamestown, a wooded area, would discover her skeletal remains. Police have not released her cause of death, but they have released the manner of death is for sure homicide. And the likelihood is that she was taken and killed the night she disappeared. There is still suspicion around Carl and Michael, but again, if police have leads about them, they have not revealed them. This coming August will be the 18-year anniversary of her disappearance and death, and by all appearances, it seems that police are no closer to finding out who killed Yolanda Bendix. If you have information, please contact this number, if you know anything at all. This composite drawing is all police have in North Carolina in terms of who killed 3 people at the Below grocery store. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of the Below store murders. Viewer discretion is advised. At approximately 6 o'clock on June 6, 1993, employees here at the Below grocery store were closing down for the night. The cleaning crew was getting ready to pack up their things. Customers were out of the building, except for one. At approximately 6:15 p.m., about 15 minutes after the store is officially closed, a man comes out with a gun. This man had apparently hid inside the store, waiting for them to close. At the time, there were 6 total employees inside the store. At gunpoint, he led all 6 into the back where the butcher would do his work. He then managed to take some duct tape and he wrapped it around the individuals. He created these human stacks. He literally bound them together and then he would place them on the ground. And he allegedly did this because he wanted to save ammunition so that he could shoot through a stack and kill multiple people with one bullet. This unknown man then just began to open fire towards these stacks of people, and he did so until he was out of bullets. He then grabbed a nearby meat cleaver and he slashed the throat of one of them, and then he stabbed another one of them so badly that the blade broke off into the victim's back. He then stole about $3,000 and then just left without making sure everybody was dead, because everybody was not. 3 people were dead, and I cannot find a photo of them, but their names are Joyce Reason, Grover Cecil, and Johnny Rankins. 2 others were seriously wounded but would survive, and then one more ended up having no injuries to him. The 3 survivors came up with this composite drawing of the man. The man never stated his motive. They felt like robbery wasn't the true motive. He came in there with the intent of killing these people. But why? It's unknown to this day. Speculation that maybe he was some sort of serial killer, a spree killer, a mass murderer who just went around and killing people and has never been caught. And that's what makes this case kind of creepy and very unsettling. He just went in there and did all this for almost nothing. The police/FBI have posted a $30,000 reward. It's been almost 30 years though. Who was this man? Hello, true crimers. This is the case of the Bowles family murders. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, unfortunately, there really isn't much information about this case. There isn't much information I can find about the family members themselves. But from what I can see, they were a very normal, just very suburban family. The family consisted of 41-year-old James, his 37-year-old wife, Darlene, and their 2 children, 12-year-old Robbie, 13-year-old Tommy. The family lived in the San Bernardino, California area. They had recently purchased a cabin in Crestline, California. This is not the exact one. So the family would treat it like a second home, a vacation home, if you will. And on the weekend of August 13th, 1965, the family would go up to their cabin to enjoy the weekend. But then by Monday, August 16th, the family wasn't seen at their normal home. James did not show up to work. When family went to knock on their door, no one answered. Their car was not in the driveway. The family appeared to be missing. Other family members knew that they were going up to their cabin, so the family would call the sheriff's department near Crestline. But for some reason, the sheriff's department never went to the cabin. The family members also contacted the construction company who built the place to see if they could send someone to check. They wouldn't. So Darlene's brother Floyd, he decided to go up there with another person to check themselves. They didn't really live in the area. That's why they were trying to reach out to the other people first. Around 5 p.m. on August 17th, 1965, Floyd and his friend arrived at the cabin, and they noticed the family's car still in the driveway. They then peered inside the window and they saw a horror story. The family's dog was lying on the couch, covered in blood. It was dead. They managed to get the door open, and when they got to the master bedroom, all 4 family members were lying in pools and pools of blood. James was lying on his back. Bobby was found in a sitting position against the wall. Darlene was crouched inside the closet, and Tommy was behind her. She was clearly trying to protect him. There was then traces of blood in the living room, in the dining area. There were .22 caliber casings all over the place. They had all been shot dead. Police found shoe prints not matching any of them. It was a size 11 in men's, and it was a bloody shoe print, so it had to come from the killer. But there's no clue who did this. They had no enemies. They irrefutably cleared all of their suspects they had. There was a guy named George Stewart who was in the area. He was a convicted child sexual assaulter. He failed a polygraph, but there was no evidence.